a few things to dive into with Ismaël Koné because he seems to be out at Marseille. It didn't really go to plan with him. We saw in a video there was actually an altercation with De Zerbi in a training session, and I imagine that that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg about what went down between De Zerbi, Kone, and the entire kerfuffle that's happened for Kone in his first stop in France. It hasn't really gone to plan. It seems like he's on the outs there, but what's the right next step for him, Brendan?
Yeah, that clip that I saw, it seemed like it was from an episode of their documentary, but that clip that isolated some altercation that looked like they had to be separated and not throw fists at each other. I think that was like some fan site that had isolated that clip because at first I read that the same as well. Like, oh, wow, Marseille's put this out. Like, that seems like you're trying to either make the player look bad, which for them, I don't think it would be advantageous if they're looking to cash in on some type of sale price because his stock has certainly dropped than when they purchased him. They had high hopes for him. You've got to think that Roberto De Zerbi was consulted before he was brought in to begin with. And very clearly, it seemed that De Zerbi did not vibe with Ismaël Koné. And for him to go to Rennes, have a bit of success with Habib Beye, but kind of struggle to keep his place in the squad. They never seemed interested, Alex, in like completing the deal. To me, that looked bad for him. And as Manuel highlighted in our conversation with him there, the fact that he's still 23 and has this many clubs on his resume, like this next team will be his fourth team since Alistair Johnson went to Celtic.
Well, and they went the same time, right? It was a week apart after the World Cup.
And, that's my point. Yeah. So it seems like this next move is really, really important for him, not just because the World Cup is coming up, but he needs to find some stability and some consistency, and he needs to find a team that wants him. And unfortunately, Marseille, a team who are contending for a title in France, they're not that team, Alex.
Yeah, well, the challenge too with Kone was just like we have to remember all the extras. Like he went, shout out to Transfermarkt. Since Manuel was on, we may as well give him a plug. I open up Transfermarkt. He's on a deal till 2029. He's like still got 4 years left. He signed for, according to here, it's 12 million euros. So almost, 18 million, $20 million when you use the figures we got over in North America. Like that's not easy to maneuver about, especially for a guy who is unwanted. Matthew Shinetti reported that he's been training on his own with 5 other players at Marseille. Their version of the Man United bomb squad that has gotten so popular over the last week. It's a tough situation because that leaves Marseille in a position. Do they sell him for a loss? Like they're not they're not the hugest of spenders. You look at a lot of the business they did. Yeah, they of course paid some big money for some of their players, but mostly the likes of like Adrien Rabiot and stuff like that. It's more bargain bins, guys maybe available on freeze. Kone was a pretty significant outlay. Leaves him in a position where do you want to take a significant loss on? I think that was the challenge with Rennes, where Rennes want him. Rennes aren't the biggest spenders because they have such a good academy. They sell a lot, they take the money and they put it back in the academy. They'll spend a $5 million a year for an experienced goalkeeper. They of course brought in like a Brice Samba, which is a great move. They'll bring in 10 mil for a striker. A few years ago, they really was kind of out of nowhere splashed for Amine Gouiri, which was kind of out of the norm, but they're not really making that, especially on a guy like Kone who has so many question marks surrounding him. So that's why I'm very curious to see what the plan is. The one that Shinetti threw out, I think is going to have to be the case, was a loan with an option to buy, where he's going to kind of have to build up his value. But then from there, the question is, who is willing to take that loan? I think there will be takers. We still have to remember he's been linked with Roma, which is an interesting move. I'm sure Rennes, if there's another loan on the table, they'd open the door back up. He was linked to Werder Bremen, Valencia. I'm sure there's other top 5 league teams that will look at him. But as you know, there's a lot of risks that come with the loan. It's no sure deal either, right?
Roma would be like a great landing place potentially, but I think a high risk, right? I think that you really run the risk, especially it being a new league, another language. I don't know if he has a good grasp of Italian. Most French speakers can pick up Italian rather quickly. Maybe it would be easier for him than Tejan Buchanan, but you got to think that would be a factor. But Roma's interest is interesting to me because I don't really think of him when I think about Ismaël Koné and comparables. I don't think of Michael Bradley and Nangolan, but those are kind of 2 players that Roma like highlighted and got at moments where I think their careers were kind of on the cusp, and they both fared very well at Roma. So I find that interesting. I hadn't really considered Roma as a potential destination. And look, I think there'll be people in his ear pushing for that. I don't think that Jesse Marsch would complain about Ismaël Koné playing in Italy, where he's more likely to see him and visit him and perhaps pump his tires, because Ismaël Koné seems like a player that really needs that. And he's a player that Jesse Marsch and several others have been vocal about, that is incredibly hard on himself and mentally might make the game more difficult for himself than he needs to. And so switching to a new place, I think, is always hard, but it does seem like a new place is needed, Ben.
And now, how much control do you think a guy like Kone would have over what destination he would go on loan? It seems like that's probably where this situation ends up. But when players approach a loan, I know we've spoken about Luc de Fougerols and what he targets in a loan, but at the end of the day, it's the club's decision, both clubs, of where this player would go on loan.
I've got to think that when the club wants, when I say nothing to do with the player, like when the club has made it clear that the player does not fit into their plans for that season, I feel like the club can be quite accommodating and perhaps even try to massage or create a situation that suits the player if they still believe in having the player back, or are they in a situation where, look, they can't cut ties with the player, so at least kind of make them happy so that the eventual divorce might be a little easier. I do think that there are clubs, and I'm sure Manuel could have spoken to that as well, that may put in an extra effort for that. I don't think De Zerbi would sign off on that. It's from the sounds of it, but I do think that it might be to Marseille's advantage to, and I do think that that's what that first loan was to Rennes. That was a place where they could keep an eye on him. They could see him develop. He could learn how to play the French game. Like I do think that there's still belief in Marseille that he was worth purchasing. He's just not worth having right now. So I do think that in that scenario that the player can have a bit more influence maybe than when it seems to be more, I don't know, systematic, that they just don't fit.
Well, the point you make about his fit is huge, because that's the Marseille approach. Marseille is a massive club, and I say that in the sense of historically and just fan pressure. There, I'd put him up right against anyone, just in terms of how intense those fans are in the stadium, online. And the reality is with Marseille, you see with all the big clubs, you're signing profiles and fits, but you just don't know how someone's going to fit in that pressure cooker. Turns out a guy like Derek Cornelius is loving it. He's living life. But a guy like Ismaël Koné, that's maybe worked against him. I think it tells you, though, everything you need to know, that Marseille were willing to send him out to a direct Ligue. I won't say rival, because they're not, but like still a team that consistently is around where Marseille is in the table, in Rennes, and didn't even put like the handshake clause they always put, that Kone was allowed to play against Marseille in the last game. That tells you everything you need to know. You're never doing that with a player that you think has a future. So I don't think they'll get in the way of a loan. I don't think, Kone will kind of have a pick of his choice. And that's why this will be informative, because I think his agency, Jesse Marsch, will have a lot to look at of where do you get the most out of Kone, because he's still just 23. It feels so old and so young at the same time, but it feels wild that he could play in his second World Cup at just 24. This is still a guy who has still a lot ahead of him.
But I think he's really he's not a lock to play in this World Cup. Like, he's really not, right?
That's why this next 12 months is everything. Like, you got to find the move, because he's a guy that if it all goes right for him, he could be one of the stars next summer. He could be one of Canada's best players. But like you mentioned, he's also in such a precarious spot where he could be on the outside looking in. His spot isn't fully guaranteed. And that's why this is genuinely one of the most important moves, because a lot of the guys, like, we're talking about moves that maybe elevate their stocks, but they're still going to be in the World Cup squad type thing. Yeah. Like, this feels like Kone's World Cup stocks, his career kind of depends on getting this next move right.
Yeah, it totally does. And that's where there's so much pressure. And we're talking about Sassuolo and Tejan. For some reason, I'm thinking about like random shirts. I can see Kone in a Lecce shirt. I don't know I can't explain to you why. What's with those colors? I don't know what it is, but like a Lecce, or wouldn't it be great if like Cesc Fabregas took a liking to him?
What a mentor that would be.
Like, that's what I'm saying. Wouldn't that be incredible? That it seems like that's what Kone needs, right? The way Marsch speaks about him publicly, I get the impression that he's someone that Kone is someone that needs a lot of affirmation and needs to know that he's got the coaches like backing, support, and belief. And some coaches don't feel that that's a responsibility to show to players, or don't show it to certain players as their own type of motivation. That could be De Zerbi, who's colder in comparison to Jesse Marsch by all accounts. I don't know. I can't speak to Cesc Fabregas' personality, but certainly someone as a player that you got to think that that's someone that Kone could learn a ton from. And as the way Marsch describes him as being a learner and student of the game, I'd love a scenario like that for him. I think that would be an ideal type of scenario.
So often we talk about, young players and their ceiling, but we should also be talking about their floor. And I think that's an important one to talk about with Ismaël Koné as he looked for this next move, whether it is a purchase or a loan. But his ceiling is clearly, a top 5 league in Europe and playing at one of the big clubs. We've seen that from the flashes of quality that he's shown in Ligue with Canada. But what's his floor? Because I think, unfortunately, that has to be part of the conversation as well. And we'll lead into one of our next points, which is another Canadian midfielder that might be approaching closer to the floor as well. But for Ismaël Koné, the floor for his career, is it MLS, Alex?
The floor for his career?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess because he did well in MLS. I think for him, it's like, I guess, whatever consistency, habits. Because I think talent level, there's still enough for top 5 leagues to gamble on him just because there's so much talent. I think the floor versus first ceiling is bench versus starter. Like, I think a coach will see like, okay, I can still get 10 minutes out of him, 15 minutes out of him. Maybe it's late in the game. You need something to just come in and break it open. I think just with his unique kind of street ball, dynamic dribbler, maverick kind of style, I think coaches would be willing to get that. But I think for Kone, his ceiling is, okay, how much do you do the consistency, starting in training, in games, little actions, boring things that maybe aren't always as fun to do, but that you got to do so that a coach can look at you and be like, all right, you're going to be my 90-minute guy every week. And I think that's going to be the battle with Kone, and he's seen that in flashes. At Montreal, he burst and he was a starter, but then he was a bench, like a super sub, and then he got his starter spot back, and then he was gone by the end of his first year at Watford. There were periods where he'd be chaining 90s together, like 2 months at a time, just 90, 90, 90, but then all of a sudden he'd be 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there. I think he's good enough that coaches will give him that shot, but it's really those consistency and habits that will distinguish him from being a bench player at his next club or really being a locked in every week 2,000-minute starter.
His floor is being teammates with Philippe Coutinho at that team in Qatar that nobody can remember, or some shit team in Saudi, maybe the one that Milan Borjan is on. I think that would be his floor.
Yeah, I would say MLS is his floor. I think it's higher than that. Just because he's proven himself in MLS, and MLS teams would probably be interested in a Canadian midfielder, especially the Canadian teams. I could see at some point like a slick midfielder that might not have the work ethic from everything that we've heard about what's gone down at Marseille. But I feel like MLS has to be his floor, not necessarily the Middle East, which I still think is probably, in particular, Saudi and Qatar, lower leagues than MLS in terms of level.
But he's still a $10 million player, right? Like, that's still like a DP in MLS. That's why I think even MLS as a floor, it feels almost like you're talking star in MLS.